There is a moment, in the very early hours of a medieval morning, before the cock has crowed and before the bells of the monastery have rung their first call to prayer, when the world holds its breath. The fire in the great hall has burned low, the rushes on the floor, scattered with dried lavender and meadowsweet, breathe out their last soft fragrance. The torches have long since guttered. Only a single candle burns, a tallow candle, thick and slow, set on the windowsill of the women's solar, casting its amber light across a pair of hands that have not yet stopped working. She's spinning. She has been spinning for 3 hours already, long before the household stirred. The thread winds between her fingers with the ease of long practice, smooth and even, the spindle turning in a slow, hypnotic arc beneath her wrist. Outside the narrow window, the sky is that particular shade of deep blue that belongs only to the last hour of darkness, not quite night, not yet morning. The stars are still visible, each one sharp and cold and perfectly still above the frost-silvered rooftops. One last owl calls from somewhere in the oak wood beyond the garden wall, a round, soft note that floats across the silence and dissolves into it. She does not look up. She has work to do. She always has work to do. Her name is not recorded in any chronicle. No monk set down her deeds in careful Latin script. No poet sang of her patience, her resourcefulness, or the quiet, extraordinary power she exercised over the daily life of the household she kept. She was simply a woman of the Middle Ages, a wife, a mother, a healer, a manager, a spinner of thread and keeper of keys and solver of problems that no one else was expected to solve. And she was one of the greatest survivors the world has ever produced. Welcome, dear listener. Settle in. Pull the weight of the day off your shoulders and set it aside for a while. It will be there when you need it, but you do not need it now. Let your body find its most comfortable position. Let your breathing slow, just slightly, just enough to feel the difference. Tonight, we are going back through centuries of firelight and cold stone, of harvest seasons and hungry winters, of plague years and prosperous summers, of great feasts and quiet fasting mornings. We are going back to find the women who were always there, always working, always enduring, in a world that was never designed to make their lives easy. This is their story, and it will carry you very gently into sleep. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To understand what it meant to survive in the medieval world, you must first understand the world itself. Not the world of illuminated manuscripts and gleaming tournaments and courtly love poems, though that world existed, in its way, for a small and privileged minority, but the world as most people actually lived it. The world of mud and cold wind and rooftops that leaked. The world of crops that sometimes failed and winters that came early and wells that sometimes ran dry. The world of bodies that aged quickly and hurt chronically and gave out without warning. The world that demanded everything from the people who inhabited it and offered, in return, the simple and difficult gift of existence. It is a world that deserves our attention now, as you close your eyes and let your breathing slow. It was real, and it was hard, and the people who lived in it were not smaller or less capable than we are. They were, if anything, more accustomed to difficulty, and more skilled in many ways at the art of keeping themselves and others alive. Imagine a village in England in the year 1250. The season is early autumn. The harvest has just come in. Not a perfect harvest, but a decent one. Enough to carry the village through to spring if the winter does not grow too severe. The fields lie stubbled and exhausted, catching the pale afternoon light in long golden strips, and the smell of wood smoke drifts across the common from a dozen low-roofed cottages. The air has that particular bite of early autumn, still warm in the afternoon sun but carrying in the shadows and the evenings the unmistakable message of what is coming. The village is small, perhaps 30 or 40 households, clustered together for warmth and company and the mutual protection that proximity provides. The cottages themselves are small by any measure, a single main room perhaps, with a beaten earth floor and a central hearth whose smoke rises more or less toward a hole in the thatch above. The walls are wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay and dung and straw, whitewashed sometimes in the better households, left bare in the poorer ones. The windows are narrow openings, shuttered against the cold with wooden boards or stuffed with straw when the weather turns. And even with them sealed as tightly as possible, The wind finds its way in along every seam and gap and crack in the structure. This is not comfortable by our standards. It was simply home. In this room, a family lives. A husband who works the land, who spends his days in the fields from the first light of morning until the last usable light of evening during the busy seasons, who carries in his body the accumulated fatigue of a working life spent outdoors in all weathers. Several children of varying ages, ranging from the infant who is still at the breast to the older ones who are already helping with whatever tasks their small bodies can manage. Perhaps a grandmother who sleeps near the fire, her joints stiffened by decades of hard work, still useful in ways that her family values even as her strength diminishes. And always, at the centre of it all, the woman who makes the household run. She woke before dawn. This is simply a fact of her life, not a hardship she has consciously chosen, or a virtue she has deliberately cultivated. It is just how her days begin, because the fire needs to be coaxed back to life from its overnight embers, because cold kills faster than hunger, and because everything else in the household depends on the fire. The bread that was set to prove the night before must be shaped and set near the embers to bake. The children must be roused and dressed and fed. The animals, if the family is prosperous enough to have animals, which many were, must be let out or tended. A pig, perhaps, kept in a lean-to behind the cottage. Chickens that roost in the rafters and drop their mess on the floor below. A cow, if God has been particularly generous. A few geese that wander the common and supplement the family's diet with their eggs through the spring and summer months. By the time the sun clears the eastern tree line and its pale light begins to fall across the stubbled fields, she has already done more work than many modern people accomplish in a full morning, and her day has barely started. This was the rhythm of medieval life for women at every level of society, from the peasant wife in her smoky one-room cottage to the chatelaine of a great castle, whose household might encompass several hundred people. The scale and the tools varied enormously. The chatelaine's fire was laid and lit by servants, her bread baked in a proper kitchen with a stone oven, her animals tended by grooms and dairymaids. But the fundamental structure of the work was the same. She was the manager. She was the one responsible. She was the one who kept track of everything and made sure that everything was done. A nobleman's responsibilities would include overseeing the stores, the vast quantities of grain and salt meat and dried fish and ale and wine and candles and firewood that had to be maintained at adequate levels through the year, with special care given to the winter stores that stood between the household and genuine shortage during the hungry months. She supervised the dairy and the kitchen, and the laundry and the garden. She managed the accounts, comparing the quantities consumed against the quantities brought in, and making adjustments when the figures did not balance. She directed the work of a dozen or more servants, each with their specific tasks, each requiring supervision and guidance and occasional correction. She received and entertained guests, which in the medieval world of lord and vassal relationships was a genuine political function, rather than a mere social pleasure. She maintained the household's charitable obligations, distributing alms to the poor who came to the gate and managing the household's contributions to the local church and the support of any religious institutions under the family's patronage. The medieval world ran on the labour of women. Not in the rhetorical sense that people sometimes mean when they say such things, not as a compliment paid from a comfortable distance, but in the direct, practical, unavoidable sense that if women stopped working, the world would stop functioning within a matter of days. The food would not be cooked, the fires would go out, the bread would not be baked, the cloth would not be woven, the sick would not be nursed, the children would not be tended. Everything that made daily life possible was, at its foundation, maintained by women. And yet the same world told them, through its laws and its customs and its theology, that they were the weaker vessel, that they needed guidance and governance, that their purpose was to serve and to obey, and that their sphere was the domestic one, and that the world of significant action and important decision-making belonged to men. It is one of history's great paradoxes, and we will spend this evening sitting with it, turning it slowly in our hands like a smooth stone found beside a stream, feeling its weight, wondering at its edges. How a world could simultaneously depend utterly on women and yet refuse, almost systematically, to acknowledge that dependence. How the most essential work could be rendered invisible by being categorized as merely domestic. How the skills of survival could be undervalued simply because everyone had them, or was supposed to have them, and no one was writing them down. The threats that the medieval woman faced were real and numerous. Disease came first and always. The medieval world had no germ theory, no understanding of how illness spread or what caused it at a biological level. What it had was observation, careful, generational, sometimes devastatingly accurate observation, and a vast inherited tradition of herbal and practical medicine that was, in many cases, more sophisticated than we sometimes give it credit for. But the diseases themselves were merciless. Dysentery killed routinely, especially in summer when contaminated water sources spread the pathogen widely. Typhoid moved through populations like fire through dry grass. Tuberculosis, the wasting sickness, was so common as to be almost unremarkable. Nearly every family knew it. Childhood mortality was staggering. A woman who bore 6 children might count herself lucky if 4 survived to adulthood, and the emotional weight of that repeated loss is something we can barely begin to imagine. Beyond disease, there was simple cold. Medieval winters in northern Europe were severe, and the insulation available to most households was minimal. Hypothermia was a real and frequent danger, particularly for the very young and the very old. Keeping a household warm through the winter months required a constant, vigilant management of fuel. The wood pile that had to be built up through summer and autumn, the peat that had to be cut and dried, the dried dung that could supplement the fire when wood grew scarce. The calculation was always the same. How much do we have? How long must it last? How can we stretch it far enough? Beyond cold, there was hunger. Famine visited medieval Europe with grim regularity. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions across the continent, an event so catastrophic that whole villages emptied, social structures began to fracture, and the psychological trauma lingered in folk memory for generations. But even in ordinary years, the late winter hunger, the hungry gap between the exhaustion of autumn stores and the first spring harvests, was a familiar and dreaded visitor. The ability to stretch provisions to preserve food against the long winter, to identify wild plants that could supplement a dwindling larder. These were skills that stood between a family and starvation, and they were overwhelmingly women's skills. And through all of this, a woman was very likely also managing pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing. Medieval women bore children frequently, and each pregnancy carried real risk. Maternal mortality, while difficult to calculate with precision for the medieval period, was high enough that women were realistically aware that childbirth might be the last thing they experienced. To go through this repeatedly, in the midst of all the other demands of a difficult life, required a quality of courage that rarely gets named as such. This was the world she inhabited, and she not only survived it, she ran it. Let the images settle around you like falling snow, soft and quiet. The cold world, the smoky fire, the hands that never quite stopped moving. You're safe here, held in the warmth of this long story, watching from a comfortable distance as history unfolds its quiet wonders. There is much more to tell. We have barely begun. There is a symbol that appears again and again in medieval art and literature, in illuminated manuscripts and tomb effigies, in the practical records of household accounts, and the dry language of legal documents, in the poetry of courtly love, and in the more workaday verse of popular tradition. It is a ring of keys. Keys hung at the belt of the mistress of the household. Heavy iron keys, the kind that required real effort to lift and operate, attached to an iron ring that clinked softly with every step she took, announcing her presence and her authority simultaneously. Each key opened a different lock: the larder, the grain store, the wine cellar, the chest where the household silver was kept, the strong-box where the important documents were stored, the room where the best cloth was laid away from moth and damp. The keys were not merely practical objects, they were a symbol of authority, as clearly understood by everyone in the medieval world as a crown or a bishop's mitre or a sheriff's rod. The woman who carried the keys held the power. Everyone in the household knew it. The chatelaine. The word itself is worth dwelling on. It comes from the Latin castellana, the woman of the castle, and it described a specific and highly demanding role that was recognised and in its way respected. She was the lord's wife, yes, but more than that, she was the chief executive of one of the most complex organisations that existed in the medieval world. A great household was not merely a home, It was a small economy, a centre of production and consumption that processed raw materials and turned them into finished goods, that employed people at many different levels of skill, that fed and clothed and sheltered a community of sometimes hundreds of people. It was a social welfare institution for the tenants and dependents who looked to it for employment, protection, and charity in times of need. It was a political institution representing its lords' interests in the local and regional power structures. Managing it required skills that we would today recognize as belonging to the domains of finance, logistics, human resources, hospitality, medicine, public relations, and occasionally emergency management. All of this management fell almost entirely to women, not because men were incapable of it. Some men managed their own households, and some were very good at it, but because the structure of medieval society allocated this sphere of activity to women as firmly and systematically as it allocated military command to men. The chatelaine managed the household. The lord managed the estate and performed military service. These were the respective roles, and they were enforced by custom, expectation, and the simple logic of who was available. A lord who was frequently away on campaign or on political business could not also be the one managing the day-to-day operations of a complex household. His wife had to be capable of doing it. When a lord went on crusade, and many did, absenting themselves from their estates for years at a time, his wife did not simply wait at home and tend the children. She ran the estate. She managed the finances, adjudicated disputes among tenants, oversaw the planting and harvesting of crops, negotiated with merchants and suppliers, corresponded with lawyers about the legal matters that always seemed to arise in a large lord's absence, managed the relationships with overlords and neighbours that kept the family's political position secure, and if necessary organised the defence of the castle itself. There are documented cases of women directing the defence of besieged castles, organising the garrison, directing the distribution of food and water, making decisions about when to negotiate and when to hold firm, with a competence that surprised contemporary commentators who had perhaps not expected it. Nicola de la Haye held Lincoln Castle against a serious military attack in 1217. She was in her 60s. She had already held the castle once before during an earlier conflict, and she would hold it again. She had been managing Lincoln Castle for years before the attack came, had overseen its provisioning and repair, had maintained the garrison, had kept the institution functioning through political upheavals that had made her position precarious more than once. When the attack came, she was ready. When the attackers finally retreated, she was acknowledged even by those who'd been on the opposing side as one of the most formidable military administrators in England. She is remarkable, and her story is well documented. But she's not entirely unique, just unusually visible in the historical record. The management of household accounts was itself a sophisticated undertaking that deserves to be recognised as such. Medieval noblewomen kept careful, detailed records of income and expenditure, of grain stored and grain consumed, of servants' wages and merchants' bills, of charitable distributions and the costs of entertainment, of the expenses of the journey taken last spring and the repairs made to the mill last autumn. These accounts survive in archives in considerable numbers, and when historians examine them, they reveal a level of financial competence and administrative rigour that is genuinely impressive. The woman who kept these accounts was doing something that required numeracy, organisational intelligence, an accurate memory, and the ability to spot discrepancies and irregularities in complex flows of goods and money. Further down the social scale, the management of household resources was no less demanding, merely smaller in scope. A merchant's wife in a medieval town might manage the family shop while her husband was away on business, handling transactions, keeping accounts, managing apprentices, maintaining the family's social standing in the guild hierarchy, making purchasing decisions, dealing with difficult customers and unreliable suppliers. When a merchant died, his widow might take over the business entirely, and many did, operating as what the law called femmes soles, independent traders in their own right, free of the coverture that normally subsumed a married woman's legal identity into her husband's. The records of medieval guilds show women members in a surprising number of trades, particularly in the textile industries. They were not anomalies, they were participants. The brewers of medieval England were predominantly women. The word brewster, the female form of brewer, was in common use precisely because most ale-making was done by women, at home and for sale to neighbours. Ale was a dietary staple, It was safer to drink than much of the available water, which was frequently contaminated in medieval towns and villages. It provided significant calories at a time when people's caloric needs were high, and their food supply was sometimes precarious. It was consumed at every meal by people of every social class, from the king at his high table to the peasant in his field. The woman who brewed the ale was performing a genuine public service, a public health function even, though no one framed it in those terms. The herbalist and healer was another figure whose role was overwhelmingly female. Medicine in the medieval world was formerly dominated by male physicians trained at university, but university medicine was expensive, available only in larger towns and cities, and often less practically useful than the accumulated herbal wisdom of women who had been treating illness and injury in their communities for generations. The village wise woman, the midwife, the herbalist who kept a physicy garden and knew which plants brought down a fever and which eased the pain of an inflamed joint. These women were the frontline healthcare providers for the vast majority of the medieval population. Most people never saw a university-trained physician in their lives. They saw the woman who came when someone was sick, the woman with the basket of dried herbs and the calm hands and the knowledge that had been gathered over decades of watching and learning. The keys at the belt, the hands that never stopped, the knowledge that lived in the body and passed like thread from spindle to cloth, from mother to daughter, across the centuries. Power, in the medieval world, did not always look the way power looks in history books. It did not always have a crown. It did not always appear in the chronicles. But it was real, and it was everywhere, and it belonged, in ways that were practical and undeniable and impossible to entirely erase, to women. Breathe slowly. Let your body settle deeper into its rest. The keys are quiet now, hanging still. The solar is dim. The candle burns on. Outside, the night wind moves through the castle corridors, but in here there is warmth and order and the quiet satisfaction of a household well kept. Someone kept it. Someone always kept it. That is what we are here to remember. The spindle turns. It has been turning in the hands of women for tens of thousands of years, long before the medieval world, long before recorded history, long before the first words were scratched into clay or stone. The drop spindle, simple as a stick weighted with a whirl of stone or clay, is one of the oldest human tools that archaeology has recovered, and it found its way from prehistoric hearths into medieval solar rooms without any significant change in its fundamental design. The physics of spinning have not altered across the millennia. Only the hands that hold the spindle have changed generation by generation, an unbroken chain of women turning raw fibre into thread in the early morning light or the late evening firelight, making from nothing something that the world could not do without. In the medieval world, this was not merely a domestic activity conducted in the margins of a woman's day. It was an industry, the foundational stage of the most important manufacturing sector in the medieval European economy. The textile trade was one of the dominant economic forces of the period, and its foundation, the raw thread from which everything was woven, was produced almost entirely by women. Spinning was so thoroughly associated with women that the distaff, the stick around which raw fibre was wound before spinning, became a cultural shorthand for femininity itself. The female line of a family was the distaff side. The word spinster, which we now use to mean an unmarried woman of a certain age, originally simply meant a woman who spins, which was, for most of the medieval period, essentially all of them. Every woman spun. Every woman who could hold a spindle was expected to produce thread, because thread was as necessary to the medieval household as water or fire. The scale of this production, if you stop to think about it, is almost impossible to comprehend. Every household in medieval England produced thread. Most households produce cloth. The cloth might be rough and homespun, used for the family's own clothing and bedding, and the 1,000 other textile needs of a household. Or it might be finer work, destined for sale at market or to a travelling cloth merchant. In either case, the work began the same way, with raw wool or flax and with a spinning tool, and with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Multiplied by the hundreds of thousands of households across medieval England alone, and medieval England was one country among many, each with its own textile economy. The amount of thread that was produced by women's hands each year is staggering. The medieval textile industry was quite literally built on women's labour, and it was the largest manufacturing sector in the medieval European economy. Let us follow the thread from its beginning, because the process itself is worth knowing. It is one of those slow, careful sequences of steps that, like baking bread or brewing ale, has its own kind of meditative beauty when you pay attention to it. It is late autumn in a village in the English Midlands, perhaps in the year 1280. The sheep have been shorn in spring, their fleeces carefully rolled and stored. The coarser fibres, the outer coat of the fleece, matted and dirty and full of vegetable matter, have been set aside for one use, the finer, softer fibres of the inner fleece for another. Through the summer, the wool has been washed, scoured in hot water with wood ash lye, which dissolves the lanolin and carries away the dirt, and then dried on frames in the sun. After drying, it has been carded. Carding is done with hand cards. 2 wooden paddles set with fine wire teeth, worked against each other in a rhythmic back and forth motion that lines the wool fibres parallel to each other and teases out any remaining knots or debris. The result of carding is a fluffy, cloud-like cylinder of prepared fibre called a rolag, which is light and airy and holds its shape loosely, ready to be drawn out into thread. She sits near the fire because the warmth keeps her fingers supple and because good light, even firelight, is essential for seeing the thread as it forms. The distaff is tucked under her left arm, holding the rolag of prepared wool within easy reach. With her right hand she drafts the fibres, drawing them out in a thin, even stream between thumb and forefinger, and with a practiced twist she sets the spindle turning. The spindle drops, its weight pulling the forming thread downward, the spin of the whirl keeping the fibres twisted and strong. She watches the thread as it forms, feeling its evenness between her fingers, making tiny adjustments that come from long habit rather than conscious thought. When the spindle nearly reaches the floor, she winds the finished thread around it, hooks the thread back into the notch at the top, and begins again. Draft, twist, drop, wind, 10,000 times in a day, or 20,000, the body finding its rhythm and settling into it. A skilled spinner can produce a pound of fine thread in a day, more, working quickly, of a coarser thread. Over a week, a month, a winter, the quantities become significant. The great wool clip of medieval England, exported to Flemish weavers to be made into the fine cloth that was one of Europe's most valuable luxury goods, was prepared at every stage before export by the hands of English women. The washing and sorting and carding and spinning were women's work, all of it, done in hundreds of thousands of homes across the wool-producing regions of England. The wealth of the great wool merchants was built on this foundation. The weaver worked on a loom, a more substantial piece of equipment that, in most households, occupied a significant portion of the available space. The warp threads were strung vertically on the loom frame, the weft woven horizontally through them on a shuttle, the pattern of the cloth created by which warp threads were raised and which were lowered on each pass. Weaving was slower than spinning, but it required a different kind of skill, a spatial intelligence, an ability to hold the pattern of the cloth in mind across hundreds of passes, to count threads and maintain an even tension across the width of the growing cloth. A skilled weaver working a simple pattern might produce a yard of cloth in a day. More complex patterns took longer. The width of the cloth was limited by the weaver's reach. The shuttle had to be thrown across the full width of the warp and caught on the other side, which required that the cloth be narrow enough for a person sitting at the loom to manage this comfortably. Beyond wool there was linen. Flax was grown specifically for its fibres, a labour-intensive crop that required a long processing sequence before the finished linen thread emerged. After harvesting, the stalks had to be retted, soaked in water for days or weeks, until the bacteria in the water had broken down the woody outer stem and left the long, silky inner fibres accessible. Then the retted stalks were dried, and then broken, crushed between the arms of a flax brake to separate the woody fragments, and then scutched, beaten with a wooden paddle to remove the remaining bits of stem. Finally, the fibres were hackled, combed through increasingly fine sets of metal teeth to separate them and remove any remaining impurities. The result of all this work was long, lustrous linen fibres, lined flax, and a shorter, coarser fibre called tow that was used for rope and coarser textiles. Both were spun using a technique similar to wool spinning but requiring somewhat different handling because the fibres were longer and smoother. The resulting linen thread was used for the undergarments worn next to the skin, for tablecloths and napkins in prosperous households, for the bandages and wrappings used in medical care, for the fine linens of the church altar. The medieval linen industry was as important as the wool industry in many parts of Europe, and it was equally women's work at every stage. The cultivation and processing of flax, the spinning of linen thread, the weaving of linen cloth, all of these were tasks that women performed in households that ranged from the most modest peasant cottage to the great cloth-producing regions of Flanders and northern France, where linen was woven on an almost industrial scale. In cities and larger towns, the textile trades had become organised and specialised in ways that changed the nature of the work, even if not fundamentally its gender. The silk women of medieval London, the silk women as they were known in contemporary records, formed a recognised trade group with their own customs and practices, who imported raw silk from Mediterranean merchants, hired apprentices and journeywomen, produced finished silk goods ranging from ribbons and braids to elaborate woven cloths, and sold their products to customers ranging from prosperous merchants to the royal household. They are documented in court records, in guild accounts, in trade records, because their economic activity was significant enough that the institutions of the city could not ignore it. They petitioned the king, they appeared before courts, they negotiated contracts, they were, by any reasonable measure, businesswomen, which is not a category that the official discourse of medieval society readily accommodated, and yet which their practice made undeniable. The economic importance of all this textile production was enormous, and it is worth sitting with that importance for a moment. In some regions and periods, the income generated by women's textile work constituted the majority of a household's cash income. A peasant family might produce most of its own food, but the cash it needed for rent, for market purchases, for the various fees and dues that the medieval system required, that cash often came from the sale of textile products, primarily thread and cloth produced by the women of the household. The woman who could spin fine thread was producing something with genuine market value, and the money she earned from it was a real contribution to the household's economic position, whatever the law might say about who technically owned it. The spindle turns, the thread forms, the cloth grows slowly across the loom. Outside the window the light is changing, the afternoon deepening toward evening, the sky taking on that particular colour that autumn afternoons have in the north, a kind of pale gold that turns almost immediately to grey. The fire needs tending. The children will be home soon. There is still an hour of good light, and the thread is coming along well, and the work continues, slow and steady and eternal, holding the world together with every twist of fibre. Let that image settle into you. The thread winding through the fingers, the steady turning of the spindle. You are the thread, smooth and continuous, unspooling gently towards sleep. There is a particular smell that belongs to the autumn stores of a medieval household, a rich, complex fragrance compounded of dried herbs and salted meat and fermenting fruit and the clean, sharp note of vinegar, and the deeper, earthier smell of root vegetables packed in sand, and the warm sweetness of dried apples hanging in strings from the rafters. If you could step into a well-stocked medieval larder in October, the smell alone would tell you something important. This family has done their work. This family's ready for winter. This family will survive. The larder and the still room were women's domains, in the deepest and most practical sense. Not because men were prohibited from them, but because the knowledge required to use them, what to put in them, how to prepare it, when it would be ready, how long it would last, was women's knowledge, accumulated over generations and passed down with the same care as the spinning skills and the herbal remedies and the midwifery techniques. It was essential knowledge, and losing it would be catastrophic in the most literal sense. A household that went into winter without adequate stores was a household that might not see spring. A household whose mistress did not know how to preserve food correctly, whose salt pork went rancid because it was not packed correctly, whose fermented vegetables turned foul because the brine was wrong, whose dried herbs had gone to dust because they were not stored in the right conditions, was a household that would suffer for it. The medieval year for the mistress of the household was organised almost entirely around the management of food production and preservation. It began in spring, when the garden needed to be planted, the physic garden with its medicinal herbs, the kitchen garden with its vegetables and pot herbs, and it accelerated through summer as the preserving work began in earnest. Each week of the summer and autumn brought a different task, a different set of things that needed to be done now before the season moved on, because the opportunity would not come again until next year. Soft fruits came first in early summer. Strawberries and raspberries, and the sour little wild cherries that grew in the hedgerows could be preserved in honey, a process that required large quantities of honey and careful attention to temperature, but produced a shelf-stable preserve that would last through winter and provide sweetness and vitamins during the months when fresh fruit was unavailable. They could be dried, spread on trays in the summer sun, or set near the fire to desiccate, reduced to sweet, intense little concentrations of summer flavour. They could be made into fruit wines, raspberry wine, elderberry wine, the mild sweet mead brewed from honey and water that was a staple of households that kept bees. Each option had its considerations. Honey was expensive, drying required the right weather, wine required specific knowledge of fermentation. The skilled housewife matched her method to her resources. Then came the plum season, and the pear season, and the great apple season that was, in many regions of England and France, the most important preserving period of the year. Apples were perhaps the most important fruit in the medieval larder. They kept reasonably well when stored correctly, laid out singly, without touching, on the shelves of a cool, dry storeroom, turned occasionally to prevent rotting, checked regularly for any fruit that was beginning to go bad and needed to be removed before it spread to its neighbours. They could be dried, pressed into cider, made into the sour verjuice used as a condiment in cooking, preserved in honey, stored in barrels of dry sand. A good apple store, carefully managed, could provide fresh fruit well into spring, while the various processed apple products provided different flavours and functions throughout the cooking year. Salt was the great preservative of the medieval world, and its management was a serious responsibility. Meat, primarily pork, since pigs were slaughtered in November, when the cold weather made preservation easier, and when the cost of feeding them through winter was no longer worthwhile, had to be salted with care. Too little salt and the meat would rot. Too much, and it would be unpalatably salty, and might draw out so much moisture that the texture was ruined. The salt had to be of good quality, relatively free from impurities that could affect the preservation. The salted meat had to be stored correctly, in barrels or on shelves where air could circulate around it, in conditions that were cool but not freezing. A side of bacon cured well and stored correctly might last through spring. Done badly, it might be lost within weeks, and the loss of a large portion of the winter meat supply was a genuine crisis. Beyond meat, there were the fermented vegetables that provided essential nutrients, including vitamin C, though no one in the medieval world knew the concept of vitamin C, through the months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Cabbage shredded and packed in salt in wooden barrels fermented slowly into something similar to sauerkraut, the lactobacillus bacteria converting the sugars in the cabbage to lactic acid, creating an acid environment that preserved the vegetable indefinitely while also, as a side effect, increasing its bioavailability and its nutritional content. Turnips and other root vegetables could be similarly preserved. The resulting foods were not elegant. They were sharp and salty and somewhat pungent, but they kept people healthy through winters that would otherwise have resulted in widespread nutritional deficiency. The still room was where the more refined preserving work took place. Here, the housewife or her appointed still-room maid distilled rosewater and other floral waters, which served both as food flavourings and as cosmetics and medicines. Here she made the fruit vinegars and herb vinegars that were used throughout the year in cooking. Here she prepared the compound medicines from dried herbs, the electuaries, the conserves, the syrups, the infused honeys that were the household pharmacy. Here she made the sweet spiced wines called hippocras, wine infused with ginger and cinnamon and sometimes other spices, sweetened with honey or sugar, that were served to honoured guests and kept as a household stock for entertaining and for medicinal use. The physic garden was the pharmacy's source material. Medieval women grew lavender for its calming and antimicrobial properties, rosemary for cooking, and for the digestive complaints that a diet heavy in salted and preserved meat could cause, mint and chamomile and meadowsweet for the stomach, valerian and hops for sleeplessness. And here perhaps we may allow ourselves a quiet smile, because valerian and hops are still used today for exactly this purpose, and the women who grew them in their physics gardens 1200 years ago knew what they knew from generations of careful observation. They grew feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain and fever, elderflower and elderberry for colds and respiratory illness, plantain for wounds and skin complaints. The list is long and specific and, when examined by modern pharmacologists, remarkably consistent with what we now understand about the biochemical properties of these plants. The knowledge of the physic garden was not magic, though it was sometimes categorized as such by those who wanted to diminish it. It was empirical medicine, developed by the slow, patient method of trying things, observing what happened, discarding what did not work, and refining what did. It was medicine that operated without the theoretical framework that modern medicine provides, but within a practical framework of observation and application that achieved, in many cases, genuinely beneficial results. Let the smell of the still room drift through your imagination as your breathing slows. Dried lavender and rosemary, the sharp sweetness of fruit vinegar, the deep, warm fragrance of spiced wine, the particular clean smell of beeswax candles, which the well-appointed still room might also produce. It is a room full of abundance and knowledge, a room that stands between the household and the long, cold winter, well-stocked and well-managed, a testament to months of careful work. The work is done for tonight. The larder is full. The stores are counted and found sufficient. The fire is banked. The house is settling into the deep quiet of late evening, and somewhere nearby the sound of the spindle has finally stopped. Rest now. You have done enough. The provisions are in. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina, having come from the ports of the Black Sea. The sailors aboard were dead or dying. Those who still lived showed the terrible signs of what they carried: blackened, swollen lymph nodes, buboes, the medieval world would call them, the size of eggs in their armpits and groins, blood seeping from the openings of the body, skin darkening and stiffening as the infection overwhelmed the body's capacity to fight it. The harbour master ordered the ships away from the port immediately, but it was already too late. The rats that had accompanied the cargo ashore had already moved into the city. The fleas that lived on the rats had already found new hosts. The bacterium that killed with such appalling efficiency had already begun to spread. The Black Death moved across Europe with a thoroughness that defies easy comprehension. It travelled along the trade routes, the same roads and sea lanes that had carried silk and spice and ideas across the continent for centuries now carried the plague, moving from port to port and town to town with the merchant ships and the travelling merchants, and the refugees fleeing the dying cities. By 1348 it was in France and England. By 1350 it had reached Scandinavia and Russia. Historians estimate that between a third and a half of Europe's entire population died in these years, perhaps 25 million people, perhaps more. Some regions were devastated almost completely. Others were strangely spared. Some communities lost 3/4 of their population. Others lost 1/4. The randomness of it, overlaid on the scale of it, made the experience almost impossible to process. For the women who lived through the plague, it was not merely a historical event occurring around them. It was the fabric of their daily existence, transformed beyond recognition. It was the smell in the air of a town where people were dying too fast to be properly buried. It was the sound of lamentation from the houses on every side. It was the specific, particular grief of losing a child, a husband, a mother, sometimes all at once, in a sequence of loss that left no space for mourning before the next loss arrived. It was the exhaustion of nursing the sick while trying to keep the healthy healthy, of managing a household whose labour force was diminishing week by week, of keeping children fed and clothed and warm in a world that was coming apart at its seams. And it was, for women, the experience of being among those most likely to still be standing when the worst had passed. Men, on average, appear to have had slightly higher plague mortality than women, for reasons that are not entirely understood. Men moved more, they travelled for trade and for war and for the various reasons that medieval society required men to be mobile, and this mobility may have exposed them to the plague at higher rates and earlier in the epidemic cycle. The clergy, overwhelmingly male and professionally obligated to attend the sick and dying, died in enormous numbers. Parishes across Europe were left without priests for months or years at a time. Physicians, university-trained, male, attending patients in the cities where plague struck hardest, died in waves. The monks of the great monasteries, living in close community and exposed to the travellers who arrived at their gates seeking charity, fell with terrible speed. The institutional structures of male authority, the church, the law, the guilds, the civic government, were among the first things to falter. Women stepped into the gaps, not as a deliberate political statement, not as a conscious act of feminist assertion, but simply because someone had to, and they were the ones left standing. The brewing continued because someone had to brew. The bread was baked because someone had to bake it. The fields were worked, not as well as they would have been with a full labour force, but as well as could be managed, because the crop could not be left to rot in the ground. The children were fed because they needed to be fed. The sick were nursed because someone had to nurse them. The nursing of the sick fell almost entirely to women. This was not new. Nursing had always been overwhelmingly women's work. But in the plague years, the scale and the danger of it were transformed. To nurse a plague victim was to risk catching the plague. This was understood even without any knowledge of germ theory. The medieval world knew that spending time near the sick was dangerous, even if they attributed this to miasma, bad air, rather than to pathogens. And yet accounts from the plague period describe women who nursed through exhaustion and fear, who sat at the bedsides of dying family members and neighbours and strangers, who continued to provide care because the alternative was to leave people to die alone, and that alternative was unacceptable to them. The management of death itself fell heavily on women. Preparing bodies for burial was traditionally women's work in the medieval world. Washing the corpse, wrapping it in its shroud, performing the small, careful rituals of leave-taking that the culture prescribed. In ordinary times, this was a solemn and meaningful task, done with care and time and the proper prayers. In the plague years, it became an almost continuous, increasingly desperate task. Gravediggers fell ill. Priests who would have administered last rites died before their parishioners. The usual rituals of mourning were impossible when people were dying faster than they could be properly attended to. And yet the women who remained continued to perform these rituals as best they could, in abbreviated form if necessary, imperfectly if nothing better was possible, because leaving the dead unacknowledged felt like a betrayal that was harder to bear than the labour of the acknowledgement. The economic consequences of the plague were enormous, and they created paradoxically a genuine expansion of opportunity for some of the women who survived it. Labour was suddenly scarce. The medieval economy had always had an oversupply of agricultural labour, which kept wages low and gave landowners considerable power over their workers. After the plague, this relationship was reversed. Workers could demand better wages. Workers could leave a bad employer and find a better one. Workers were needed urgently in every sector of the economy, and this need overrode many of the usual restrictions on who could perform what work. Women entered the paid labour force in larger numbers and in more varied roles than had been possible before. They worked in agriculture. They worked in the craft workshops that the guild system had previously restricted to men. They ran businesses that their dead husbands had left behind. They hired themselves out for wages that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. This changed world did not last. As populations gradually recovered over the following generations, and as the institutional structures of male authority regained their footing, the restrictions on women's economic participation were progressively reimposed. The guilds rebuilt their exclusivity. The law reasserted coverture. The church returned to its teachings about female subordination. But for 2 or 3 generations after the first great wave of plague, something had shifted, and it could not be entirely unshifted. Women had been essential. Women had managed. Women had kept the world going when everything that was supposed to keep it going had failed. This was not easily forgotten, even when it was not enshrined in any legal provision or formal acknowledgement. In the deep of the night, in the plague year, a woman sits with her remaining children in a room where the fire has burned low. The town outside is quieter than it has ever been in her memory, quieter than it should be, the silence of absence rather than the silence of sleep. Tomorrow there will be more to do than she has the energy to contemplate. But tonight she is still. The children are breathing. The fire is alive. She has survived another day, and she will survive tomorrow, and that is what survival means. Not triumph, not ease, simply the continuing, the going on, the presence of the next morning. The morning always came, it was always hard, they always met it. Rest now in the warmth of this quiet room, far from those difficult centuries. You are safe here. The world has survived, and so have you. Beyond the castle and the cottage, beyond the market town and the merchant's house, beyond the pilgrim road and the village common, there was another world that medieval women inhabited, a world of stone and silence and candlelight and learning, a world where women could exercise a degree of authority and intellectual freedom that was simply unavailable to them in secular life. The world of the convent was not, for many of the women who entered it, a retreat from the world. It was an alternative world, one with its own forms of constraint certainly, but also with its own, sometimes remarkable forms of power. The great abbeys of medieval Europe were centres of culture, learning and economic power. They owned land, sometimes vast tracts of it, accumulated through donations from the faithful over centuries. They employed large numbers of people, not only the nuns who were the community's core members, but the servants, craftspeople, and estate workers who kept the institution running. They educated the daughters of the nobility, providing a schooling that was, in many cases, more rigorous and more intellectually substantial than what was available to young men of comparable social standing outside a religious context. They preserved manuscripts. The great libraries of the monastic world were the primary repositories of classical and early medieval learning, and the copying and preservation of texts was one of the most important cultural functions that any medieval institution performed. They provided medical care to the surrounding community. They dispensed charity to the poor. They prayed, which in the medieval world was not merely a private devotional activity, but a genuine social service. The prayers of a religious community were understood to benefit the entire Christian society, and the wealthy families who endowed abbeys received in return the assurance that their souls and the souls of their ancestors would be prayed for in perpetuity. The abbess who governed such an institution was, by any reasonable measure, a powerful person. She owned property, in the name of her house rather than in her own name, but effectively as the person who controlled and disposed of it. She made legal decisions, appearing before courts and in legal disputes on behalf of her institution. She managed an economy, overseeing the income and expenditure of an organization that might, in a great abbey, rival the complexity of a medium-sized noble estate. She governed a community of women, sometimes dozens, in the largest houses hundreds, exercising the full range of monastic discipline, including the power to penalize, to correct, and in extreme cases to expel. She corresponded with popes and kings and bishops, maintaining the complex political relationships that kept her house's autonomy and privileges secure. She received important guests. Royalty visited the great abbeys not merely for devotion, but because the abbess was a significant figure whose hospitality was worth cultivating. She was, in short, a great lady of the church, and she was treated as such. Hildegard of Bingen stands at the peak of what the medieval monastic life for women could produce, and she is worth contemplating at some length. Born in 1098, the 10th child of a noble Rhineland family, she was offered to the church as a child, a practice called oblation, understood as a tithe of the family's children to God, which was common among the nobility, and which could lead, in fortunate cases, to exactly the kind of intellectual and spiritual development that Hildegard experienced. She spent her early life in a small community attached to the monastery of Disbodenberg, learning under the guidance of the visionary recluse Jutta of Sponheim. When Jutta died, and Hildegard became the leader of the small community, she was in her early 40s, already a woman of considerable spiritual authority and intellectual depth. Then she began to write. The visions she had experienced since childhood, which she had previously kept largely to herself, were now recorded in Latin. The Scivias, Know the Ways, a vast work of visionary theology in which elaborate allegorical scenes were described and interpreted, illuminated by miniature paintings that Hildegard herself may have directed. The work was submitted to Bernard of Clairvaux for evaluation, and eventually received the approval of Pope Eugenius III at the Synod of Trier, a formal ecclesiastical endorsement that gave Hildegard a platform she used with extraordinary confidence for the rest of her long life. She composed music, 77 liturgical songs in a style unmistakably her own, with melodic lines of unusual range and expressive power that have fascinated musicians since their rediscovery in the 20th century. She wrote theological works, natural history, a medical text, an encyclopedic work on the properties of plants and stones and elements. She maintained correspondence with some of the most powerful figures of her time, not differential correspondence seeking favour or protection, but confident, sometimes challenging letters in which she praised, exhorted, warned, and occasionally rebuked. She told the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa that his conduct risked divine punishment. She told popes that they were failing in their duties. She went on preaching tours, speaking in public in cathedral cities across the Rhineland, in an era when women were not supposed to preach publicly, and she did it with the authority of someone who knew, absolutely, that she had something important to say, and that she was being called to say it. She died in 1179 at the age of 81, having spent 4 decades as one of the most remarkable women in medieval European history. She was not unique in kind. There were other women who wrote, who composed, who governed, but she was unique in the combination of her gifts, the scale of her achievement, and the confidence with which she deployed both. She pushed the boundaries of what a medieval woman was permitted to do and be, and she pushed them far. Most women in medieval religious life did not write theology or compose music or correspond with emperors. Most of them copied manuscripts and kept accounts, and prayed at the canonical hours, and went about the daily business of managing a complex institution. But the exceptional cases matter, not only for their own sake, but because they demonstrate what was possible. They show what the system could accommodate when pushed, what heights could be reached when someone had the gifts and the determination and the institutional position to reach them. Hildegard is the ceiling, and the ceiling tells us something important about the room. The quiet of the cloister garden in the late evening has a particular quality. The stone walls hold the last of the day's warmth, radiating it gently into the cooling air. The herbs in their ordered beds release their fragrance as the temperature drops. Lavender and rue and the complex resinous smell of rosemary, the faint sweetness of chamomile. The bell for Compline rang an hour ago, and the sisters processed back to the dormitory in the purple dusk, their white habits catching the last light, their voices joining in the antiphon that closes the day's prayer. Now the garden is empty, and still, and full of growing things. She sits for a moment in the church, alone, before she too retires. The candles on the altar burn steadily. The stone faces of the carved figures look out from the shadows with expressions that have no particular emotion. They are simply there, enduring, as stone endures. Outside the small high windows, the stars are appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow there will be accounts to review and letters to dictate, and a visiting bishop to receive with the appropriate ceremony, and a dispute between 2 of the tenants to adjudicate, and at least 3 of her sisters who need pastoral attention of one kind or another. The life of an abbess is not a contemplative life in any simple or comfortable sense. It is a life of perpetual management, of constant decision-making, of holding together a complex human institution in a world that is always trying to complicate it. But tonight, for this one moment, the cloister is still and the candles burn and the growing things in the garden breathe out their fragrance, and it is enough. Let that stillness come to you now, soft as the breath of herbs in a night garden. Let your thoughts quiet one by one like candles gently snuffed. The world of the cloister holds you, ancient and calm and enduring. Rest in it. The market day in a medieval town began before the sun was properly up. By the time the morning light was strong enough to see clearly by, the stalls were already set up and the goods laid out. The early buyers moving through the rows with the purposeful air of people who know what they are looking for and do not intend to pay more than they should. The sounds of the market filled the square. The calls of the sellers announcing their wares, the bargaining that was the medium through which every transaction was conducted, the creak of cartwheels on the cobblestones, the occasional lowing of cattle or protest of geese, the murmur of 100 conversations overlapping into a general hum of commercial life. In any medieval market you would find women, selling, buying, managing the whole commercial operation of their household's livelihood, with the easy confidence of people who have been doing this for years. They were not anomalies. They were not there at the sufferance of a system that grudgingly tolerated their presence. They were participants in the essential economic life of their community, and the community knew it and relied on it, whatever the law and the guilds and the theological tradition might formally prefer to say about women's proper place. The market woman selling dairy produce was perhaps the most visible representative of women's economic participation, at the ordinary village or small-town level. The dairy was women's work. The milking, the churning, the cheese-making, the management of the dairy's equipment, and the careful attention required to prevent contamination in a world without refrigeration. The surplus from the household dairy, the butter and cheese and eggs that exceeded the household's own needs, went to market, carried there by the woman who'd made it or by her daughters, sold for the cash that the household needed for rent and taxes, and the various purchases that domestic production could not supply. The transactions were conducted by women, the money was earned by women, and while the law might say it belonged to her husband, in practice the management of it often remained in the hands of the woman who had earned it. The femme sole, the woman trading independently, was a recognised legal status in many English and European towns, allowing a married woman to trade in her own name if she could demonstrate that her business was a genuinely separate enterprise from her husband's, or if her husband was absent or incapacitated. This was not a radical feminist provision. It was a practical accommodation to the economic reality that women were trading, and that the economy needed them to continue trading even when strict application of coverture law would have made this legally problematic. The law, in other words, bent to accommodate reality even when its theoretical framework was uncomfortable with doing so. Widows were the clearest case of women's economic participation because widows had full legal independence. They were not covered by any man's authority, and they could sue and be sued, own property, enter into contracts and conduct business in their own names. The records of medieval towns are full of widows who did exactly this, who took over their late husband's businesses and ran them, sometimes for decades, with apparent competence. The assumption that a widow who'd been married to a craftsman or a merchant for 20 years did not know the business was simply factually wrong. She had been there. She had kept the accounts. She had dealt with customers and suppliers. She had watched and learned and participated, even if her participation was not formally recognised in the guild registers. When her husband died, the knowledge was in her. She used it. The brewing trade offers one of the clearest illustrations of women's economic participation and the forces that eventually displaced it. In the early and central medieval period, brewing was a household industry, conducted alongside other domestic production, managed by women as part of the general work of the household. The alewife, identifiable by the long stick hung with an ale bush at her door on brewing days, announcing that ale was available for purchase, was a fixture in every community, and the ale she sold was a genuine public service. It provided nutrition, it provided safer hydration than untreated water, it provided a place where people could gather and exchange information, and maintain the social bonds that communities depended on. As the trade grew more profitable, as urbanization created larger markets, as the introduction of hops extended the shelf life of ale into beer and made larger-scale production economically viable, as capital began to accumulate in the hands of people who could invest in larger brewing equipment, men moved into the trade. The guild system, which provided the regulatory and social framework for the organisation of trades in medieval towns, was generally structured to favour men. The guildmasters were men. The apprenticeship system was structured around male participation. The social networks of the guild were male networks. As brewing became more organised and more profitable, it became more male. The alewife became a figure of satire and suspicion rather than a valued community resource. The brewster gave way to the brewer, and the brewer was male. This pattern, women dominant in a trade in its informal, household-based phase, men moving in as it became more formally organised and more lucrative, repeated itself across multiple sectors of the medieval economy. It is not a medieval peculiarity. It is a pattern that has appeared in many societies and many historical periods, and it tells us something important about the relationship between economic gender discrimination and the formal institutions through which economic life is organised. It was never that women could not do the work. It was that the institutions that controlled access to the most profitable forms of the work were built to exclude them. And yet they continued. They continued to trade, to manage, to produce, to participate in the economic life of their communities at every level that was accessible to them. The evidence is there in the records, in the court cases where women appear as parties to commercial disputes, in the guild rolls where female names appear in unexpected numbers in unexpected trades, in the tax records where widows' businesses are assessed alongside those of their male neighbours, in the probate inventories that reveal, when the husband died and the household's goods were counted, that the widow's contribution to the household's wealth was often as substantial as his. The market is quietening now. The afternoon sun is lower, the light softer, the vendors beginning to pack up their unsold goods and count their day's earnings. The square is slowly emptying, the sounds of commerce fading into the ordinary sounds of a town settling toward evening. Somewhere a church bell is ringing, measuring out another hour of the diminishing day. She counts her takings in the palm of her hand. Not a large sum, but enough for what was needed. She wraps the coins in a cloth and tucks them away, lifts her basket, adjusts the weight of it on her arm, and begins the walk home. Tomorrow there will be more to do. There always is. Tonight, the fire and the supper and the children waiting. She's already thinking about what needs doing, already planning, already ahead of the moment she is in. This is the quality that kept the world running. This is the quality worth honouring, worth remembering even now. The medieval day ended earlier than ours, without the cheap, reliable artificial lighting that makes our evenings nearly indistinguishable from our afternoons. Most medieval households closed down their main activities as the daylight faded. Candles were expensive, tallow ones less so, but still a cost that careful households managed, and working by firelight or candlelight was possible but limited. The natural cadence of the medieval day followed the sun more closely than ours does, and as the sun went down, the world quieted and the household contracted around the fire. But not to sleep, not immediately. In the long winter evenings before the household retired, there were still hours of the evening to be used. The women of the family gathered near the fire, the only warm place, the only real light worth working by. And they worked. They spun. They mended clothing and shoes and harness and the 1,000 other items that constant use wore through and that had to be kept serviceable. They did the fine, close work of embroidery and lace-making and the crafting of small goods, the work that required attention but allowed the hands to move while the mind was elsewhere. They talked in the easy, companionable way of people who know each other well and have been talking for years, who can communicate in half sentences and significant looks, and the particular shorthand of long familiarity. They told stories. The oral tradition of the medieval world was enormous in its scope and importance, and women were its primary carriers, the grandmothers who remembered the tales their grandmothers had told, the mothers who shaped the stories for their children, the neighbours who gathered in each other's houses on winter evenings and exchanged the stories that made the community's shared world meaningful. These stories are largely invisible to us now because they were not written down, or rather they were written down only much later, transformed by the writing into something different from what they were in the living tradition. But we can hear their echo in the folk tales that were eventually collected, in the ballads and songs that found their way onto parchment, in the patterns of legend and narrative that cluster around particular figures and places, and that clearly predate any written record. The women's evening gathering was also a space for the exchange of practical information, the kind of knowledge that was too specific and too situational to be written in any general guide, but that was essential to managing the challenges of daily life. How to treat a particular kind of fever that was going around the village, where the best wild garlic grew this year, who had grain to sell and who was running short, which of the village's young men had been asking questions about which of its young women, the state of the harvest in the fields to the north, the condition of the road to the market town. This kind of information, social, practical, environmental, was the raw material of community decision-making, and the women who gathered in the evenings were its primary processors and distributors. The churching of women deserves a mention here, as one of the moments when women's social life was most visible and most clearly their own. Churching was a ceremony of thanksgiving and ritual purification offered to women who had survived childbirth, conducted at the church by the priest, typically 4 to 6 weeks after delivery when the mother had sufficiently recovered. It marked the woman's return to full public participation in the life of her community. But around the ceremony, above and below it, grew the celebrations that were specifically women's domain, the gathering of female neighbours and friends who had helped through the birth, and who now celebrated the survival of mother and child, the feast or the informal gathering that followed the service, the hours of company and conversation that were understood to belong to the new mother and her female circle. Medieval church court records, which fret about the excessive eating and drinking that accompanied these gatherings, tell us incidentally that women were enjoying themselves, that the celebrations were real and substantial and apparently quite cheerful, in a way that the official record rarely acknowledges. The mutual aid network that women maintained was one of the most important social welfare systems of the medieval world, and it operated largely through these informal gatherings, the evening visits, the gatherings around a birth, the communal work of harvest time, the shared prayers at the church, the hundreds of small interactions that made up the texture of community life. When someone was sick, her female neighbours came. When someone died, the women of the community managed the immediate practical aftermath, the laying out, the preparation for burial, the initial care of the surviving children and household. When someone was struggling, with poverty, with illness, with the aftermath of a difficult birth or the loss of a husband, it was her female network that noticed, that mobilized, that found ways to help. This network was invisible in most of the formal record of the medieval world. It did not appear in the chronicles or the legal records except in fragments and glimpses. It was not an institution in any formal sense. It had no charter, no officers, no written rules. It was simply the way that women organized themselves and each other, the way they turned the social fabric of the community into a practical resource that was available when it was needed. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most resilient and effective social institutions that the medieval world produced. The fire has burned lower now. The last of the spinning is wound around the spindle and set aside for tomorrow. The children have long since been settled, their breath slow and even in the corner of the room. Somewhere outside, the wind is picking up, carrying with it the smell of rain that has not yet arrived but is coming. The woman by the fire sits for a moment in the stillness, her hands finally still in her lap, listening to the sounds of the household breathing around her. The slow, regular breath of sleep, the small sounds of the fire, the distant movement of the wind in the thatch above. This is the moment before she too sleeps. This is the moment that belongs entirely to her, without demand or obligation, in the last quiet of the day. Let that moment be yours. Let the fire breathe and the house be still, and the darkness wrap around you like something gentle. The work of the day is done. The work of tomorrow has not yet begun. There is only this, the warmth, the quiet, the deepening of breath towards sleep. You're safe. The night is kind. Sleep is coming. The quiet heroines of medieval life, the spinners and brewsters and midwives, the capable wives and skilled housekeepers, the anonymous preservers of everyday existence, deserve their central place in this story. But alongside them, sometimes emerging from their ranks, and sometimes descending to them from heights of privilege, were the women who walked directly into the historical record and refused to be ignored. The women whose actions were too consequential for even the most determined chronicler to omit. The women who governed kingdoms, directed wars, and survived political catastrophes that destroyed everyone around them. Eleanor of Aquitaine is perhaps the most famous woman of the medieval world, and her fame is justified by the extraordinary arc of her life. Born around 1122 to the powerful Duke of Aquitaine, she inherited his duchy at 15 when her father died unexpectedly on pilgrimage, and she was married within months to Louis VII of France, in a union that was politically necessary but personally, it seems, eventually unsatisfying. She accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, which did not go well for anyone concerned. The marriage ended in annulment in 1152. Within 2 months she had married the future Henry II of England, with whom she would have 8 children and an increasingly difficult relationship that eventually ended with her imprisonment. She was imprisoned by Henry for 15 years, confined under house arrest in various English castles after she supported their son's rebellion against him in 1173. This might have ended her story. For many women in her position, it would have. But Eleanor was not finished. Henry died in 1189, her favourite son Richard became king, and she emerged from imprisonment at the age of 65 with apparently undiminished energy and purpose. She travelled to Navarre to collect Richard's bride. She helped govern England while Richard was on crusade. When Richard was captured on his way home and held for ransom by the Duke of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor, she negotiated his release in person, an old woman making a dangerous winter crossing of the Alps to secure her son's freedom, and then helped raise the enormous ransom that was required. She outlived Richard and lived to see her youngest son John become king. She died in 1204 at approximately 82 years of age, having spent the last months of her life in the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she was buried alongside her husband and her son. She had been a duchess, a queen of France, a queen of England, a prisoner, a diplomat, and a regent. She was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable people of her century. Blanche of Castile was a different kind of remarkable, less dramatic in her individual story perhaps, but no less significant in her impact. She came to France as a young woman, married to the future Louis VIII, and demonstrated from early in her marriage the qualities that would make her one of the most effective political actors of her age: intelligence, decisiveness, an ability to manage complex political relationships, and a genuine gift for knowing when to be conciliatory and when to be firm. When her husband died, and her son Louis IX came to the throne as a minor, she became regent of France, and she governed the kingdom with a competence that silenced most of her critics. She suppressed a baronial rebellion that threatened to undo her regency in its early years through a combination of military action and skilled negotiation. She managed the complex politics of a great medieval kingdom, the relationships with the papacy, with the Holy Roman Empire, with England, with the fractious French nobility, with a sureness of touch that her contemporaries acknowledged, even when they did not entirely welcome it. She served as regent a second time when Louis went on crusade, and she governed France until she died in 1252, still at her work, still holding the kingdom together. Her son, who was a genuinely saintly and admirable person, acknowledged that he owed more to his mother than to almost anyone else in his life. This is the testimony of a man who became a king and a saint, and it is worth taking seriously. The pattern of women governing in their husbands' absences, on crusade, on campaign, in captivity, is so consistent across the medieval record as to constitute a basic feature of medieval political life. This is not because medieval society had a theory of women's political capacity that it was generously putting into practice. It is because medieval society had a practical need for someone to govern when the lord was absent, and the person available to do it was generally his wife, who had been managing the household and the estate for years, and who had the skills required. The appointment was pragmatic. The performance was, very often, excellent. Margaret of Anjou came to England as the Queen of Henry VI in 1445, and she spent the next quarter-century fighting for the survival of the Lancastrian monarchy with a tenacity that her opponents found alarming, and that history has treated with something between admiration and suspicion. She had to fight because her husband could not. Henry VI suffered from a serious mental illness, possibly catatonic schizophrenia, that left him incapable of governing for long periods and incapable of providing the decisive leadership that a contested monarchy required. Margaret stepped into the gap that his illness created. She was not a timid replacement. She was, by the accounts of those who dealt with her, formidable, determined, politically shrewd, personally brave, and committed to the Lancastrian cause with an intensity that never wavered even when everything around it was collapsing. She lost. In the end, she lost everything. Her husband killed in the Tower, her son killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, her freedom gone, her cause extinct. She ended her life in poverty in France, having outlived her son by 7 years. But she did not go quietly, and she did not go quickly. She fought for 2 decades. She raised armies and negotiated alliances and crossed the Channel multiple times, in pursuit of a cause that most people had given up on long before she did. The quality of her persistence, even in a losing cause, is one of the things that makes her story worth knowing. These women, Eleanor, Blanche, Margaret, and the hundreds of less famous women who governed estates and managed households and held things together when the men were gone, had something in common that is worth naming. They had all spent years before the crisis came, doing exactly the kind of complex institutional management that the crisis would require. Eleanor had governed Aquitaine. Blanche had governed her household and her family's political relationships. Margaret had managed the political complexities of a court whose king was sometimes incapable of managing them himself. They were not unprepared for power when it came to them. They had been preparing for decades in the only training ground available to medieval women, the daily, demanding, under-acknowledged work of managing everything that needed to be managed. The stars are bright above the castle towers. The night watch has called the hour, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Below, in the great hall, the fire has burned to embers, and the sleeping household is perfectly still, but in the solar above, a single candle burns. It has been burning for hours, and will burn for hours more, and a woman sits at her desk, reading, planning, writing the letter that needs to be written before morning comes. She will rest when the work is done. The work is never entirely done, but tomorrow it will be someone else's problem if she does her job tonight. She always does her job, that is who she is. In the village, when someone was sick, it was a woman who came. She came quietly, at whatever hour the need arose. Early morning, late evening, the middle of the night when the fever spiked, or the breathing grew laboured, or the labour came on early and unexpectedly. She brought her basket, which held the things she might need. dried herbs, wrapped carefully in cloth, their fragrance still present beneath the linen wrapping, a small knife for cutting and preparing, a pot or a flask for the infusion that would be needed. Perhaps a salve already made and waiting, or a poultice prepared in the previous hours when she knew the call might come. She came because she had been asked, or because she had been watching, and knew her presence would be needed before anyone got around to asking. She knew her community the way a physician knows their practice, not theoretically, but in the specific, personal, embodied way of someone who has been paying close attention for decades. Her medicine was empirical. This word is important. Empirical means based on observation and experience rather than theory, and the village healer's knowledge was exactly that. It was not derived from the classical texts that university-trained physicians relied on, though some of those texts circulated in lay society in simplified form, and some women who could read had access to them. It was derived from generations of careful observation. This plant, used in this way at this time of year, produces this effect. This combination of symptoms tends to resolve in this number of days if these preparations are used. This kind of labour requires patience and this kind of intervention. This wound needs cleaning with this preparation, or it will fester. The theoretical framework was absent. The practical knowledge was substantial. Willow bark was used for pain and fever. The active compound in willow bark is salicin, which the body metabolizes into salicylic acid, the chemical basis of aspirin. The medieval healer did not know this. She knew that it worked. She knew that giving an infusion of willow bark tea to a patient with a high fever would bring the temperature down and ease the aching. This was empirical knowledge, and it was correct, and it was derived from centuries of careful observation by women who were paying attention. Elderberry was used for colds and respiratory illness. Modern clinical trials have confirmed that elderberry preparations reduce the severity and duration of influenza symptoms, probably through flavonoid compounds that interfere with viral replication. The medieval healer did not know the mechanism. She knew that elderberry syrup given at the onset of a cold helped the patient recover faster. This was empirical knowledge, and it was correct. Chamomile was used for fever and inflammation and stomach complaints. Its active constituents include chamazoline and bisabolol, which have documented anti-inflammatory and antispasmodic effects. Valerian was used for sleeplessness. Its active compounds include valerianic acid, which appears to interact with GABA receptors in the brain in a manner that produces sedation. The mechanism is similar to that of some pharmaceutical sedatives. Garlic was used for infections. It contains allicin, which has genuine antimicrobial properties. Feverfew was used for headaches. Its active constituent parthenolide inhibits the production of prostaglandins that contribute to inflammation and migraine. None of this knowledge was magic. All of it was observation, accumulated and tested and refined across generations by women who were paying close enough attention to notice what worked and what did not. The fact that they did not have a biochemical explanation for what they observed does not make the observation less valid. The observation was often more reliable than the theories that university-trained physicians were offering. The midwife, who was often the same person as the village healer or who worked alongside her, performed the most essential and the most dangerous medical function in the medieval community. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women between the ages of 15 and 45 in the medieval world, and the management of that risk fell entirely to women. No male physician was present. No man was admitted to the birthing chamber. The midwife and her assistants, the gossips, the close female friends who attended the birth and provided support and practical help, managed the entire process. A skilled midwife knew a great deal. She knew how to assess the progress of labour, to distinguish between normal progression and the signs of difficulty that required intervention. She knew how to manage a prolonged labour without causing exhaustion that would reduce the mother's capacity to push when pushing was finally needed. She knew how to handle a hand or foot presentation, the delivery of a baby arm or leg first rather than head first, which is a serious complication requiring specific techniques. She knew how to manage the third stage of labour, the delivery of the placenta, and how to address the hemorrhage that was the most common immediate cause of maternal death. She knew the signs of puerperal fever, the infection that often set in the days following delivery, and she knew which preparations might help and which patients to watch most carefully. She also knew the importance of cleanliness, not in any theoretical bacteriological sense, but in a practical sense derived from observation. Midwives who were careful about washing their hands and their instruments, who kept the birthing chamber as clean as possible, who changed the linens promptly and kept the patient warm and dry had better outcomes. This was empirical knowledge of the most important kind. It did not need a theoretical framework to be valid. It needed only accurate observation and the willingness to act on it. The physics garden in the evening, in the last light of a late summer day. She moves through it with the ease of long familiarity, bending to check the lavender for dryness, pinching a stem of rosemary and holding it to her nose, assessing the readiness of the elderberries by their colour and firmness. The garden is doing well this year. The summer has been good, enough rain without too much, and the plants are healthy and abundant. She'll have more than enough of most things to last through winter, with some to spare for the neighbours who will come when they are needed. She straightens and looks around at what she has built and tended over decades, the ordered beds, the neat paths, the wooden frames for the climbing plants, the stone wall that holds the heat and creates the sheltered microclimate that allows her to grow things that would not survive in a more exposed position. It is good work. It is work that she knows, and that knows her in return, the way a garden always knows the hands that tend it. The knowledge in her hands will not be written down, it will be passed to her daughter, or to the young woman from the next village who has been coming to learn. It will persist as long as someone carries it and tends it, like the garden itself. Some of it will be lost when she's gone. Some of it will survive. This is the nature of all knowledge. It lives in people, and people are mortal, and the knowledge must be passed on or it is lost. But tonight the garden is full and the knowledge is alive and the evening is soft and warm and full of fragrance and she is here, and it is enough. Winter in the medieval world had a quality that we have largely lost, a quality that is difficult even to describe accurately to someone who has only ever lived in the electrically lit, centrally heated, continuously connected modern world. It was genuinely still. Not quiet in the way that a quiet room in a modern house is quiet, with the distant hum of appliances and traffic and the constant background noise of a technological civilization, but still in the way that a world without those things could be still. The stillness of snow, of cold, of early darkness, of everything slowing to the pace that the season naturally required. The short days and long dark nights of a northern European winter created a genuine fallow period that no amount of cultural pressure could entirely overcome. When the sun set at 3 in the afternoon and did not rise again until 8 the next morning, when the cold made outdoor work genuinely dangerous and the roads were impassable and the fields were under snow, the pace of life slowed. Not to idleness, the spinning continued, the animals needed tending, the fire needed fuel, but to a different register, a slower and more inward rhythm that the medieval world, with its rich, contemplative tradition, had ways of honouring and using. Julian of Norwich is the woman who sits at the centre of the medieval English contemplative tradition, or rather, she sits in the cell at the side of the church of St. Julian in Norwich, the enclosed, tiny space that she chose as her life's home, and from which she looked out on the world through a small window and wrote the first book in the English language known to have been composed by a woman. Julian chose enclosure, chose to have herself walled into a small room attached to a church with 2 windows, one looking into the church interior, one opening onto the street, and a servant to bring food and carry away waste, and no ability to leave and no desire to. This might sound like imprisonment. It was instead a form of freedom. Freedom from the obligations and distractions of secular life. Freedom to attend entirely to the inner life. Freedom to think and pray and write without interruption. She had experienced a series of visions during a serious illness in her 30s. Intense, specific, theologically rich visions that she spent the rest of her long life meditating on and writing about. The resulting work, the revelations of divine love, exists in 2 versions, a shorter, earlier text written close to the time of the visions, and a longer, later text that is the product of decades of further reflection. Both are remarkable. The later text is one of the great works of English prose and one of the most sophisticated works of medieval theology, made more remarkable by the fact that its author was a woman writing in a tradition that generally did not permit women to write theology publicly. She wrote about God's love with an intimacy and a confidence that was, in her cultural context, extraordinary. She was not apologetic about what she had to say, or deferential about her right to say it. She claimed her visions as genuine revelation, submitted them to the authority of the Church, and then proceeded to think about them with exceptional rigour and originality. She explored the problem of suffering. How can a God who is love permit the existence of evil and pain, with a depth and honesty that does not flinch from the difficulty of the question? And she arrived at the conclusion that has become her most quoted phrase, the sentence that has followed her out of the 14th century and into the 21st, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." She wrote this in the middle of the plague century. She wrote it in a world that had seen the death of half its population within living memory, in a town that had been struck repeatedly by epidemic disease, in a religious tradition that was simultaneously rich in consolation and deeply scarred by theological anxiety. She wrote it having looked at suffering directly, having not turned away from the question of how suffering and love can coexist, and having found an answer that was not a denial of the problem, but a transformation of the perspective from which it was viewed. The reassurance she offered was not shallow. It was earned by someone who had looked at the worst the world had to offer, and still somehow found a foundation beneath it that held. Most medieval women were not mystics or contemplatives. Most of them did not write, and most of those who could read were not reading theology in their spare time. But the inner life that Julian represented in its most refined and articulate form was not entirely separate from the inner life of ordinary women going about their ordinary days. The prayers said at rising and lying down, the beads counted through in the pattern of the rosary, the particular quality of attention given to the world when one believes that the world is sacred, that the bread one bakes, and the child one tends, and the sick one nurses are all encompassed within a divine care that takes notice of everything. This kind of inner life required no special education and no formal training. It required only the willingness to attend, and the medieval world's tradition of contemplative practice gave it form and language and meaning. The books of hours that many prosperous women owned in the later medieval period were small, personal, beautifully illustrated collections of prayers and devotions, calibrated to the hours of the day and the seasons of the liturgical year. They were the most personal and intimate objects that many women possessed. They were carried about, consulted privately, prayed over in the early morning or the late evening. They were given as gifts between women who loved each other. They were specified in wills, passed on to daughters or granddaughters or beloved friends. They were the material form of the inner life, the place where the contemplative practice met the physical world and was given an object to attach itself to. The long winter evening, then, was not empty time. It was the time when the inner life had room to breathe, the time when the prayers said in daylight were said again in the different quality of candlelight or firelight, the time when the stories were told and the music was made and the embroidery was worked, each of these activities carrying its own kind of contemplative quality when done slowly and with attention. The time when sleep approached gradually, in the way that good sleep does approach when the day has been full and the body is ready and the mind is finally willing to be still. The fire burns very low now. The room is warm enough just. Outside the snow is falling. She can hear it in the quality of the silence, the particular muffled stillness that snow creates, pressing down on the sounds of the village, wrapping everything in a white quietness that is almost like kindness. The candle is guttering. She will not light another. It is late enough and the work is done and sleep is close. All shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. Let those words carry you now through the last thin membrane between waking and sleep. The medieval world that produced them was hard and cold and full of difficulty. The woman who wrote them knew this. She wrote them anyway because she believed them and because she wanted you to know it too, across all the centuries between her small stone room and this moment of your rest. All shall be well. Sleep. The candle on the windowsill is burned to its last quarter of an inch. The flame is very small now, a single point of amber, barely moving, holding its light against the darkness with a kind of patient stubbornness that mirrors something essential in the women whose story we have been telling tonight. Outside, the sky has shifted from the dark blue of midnight to the slightly less dark blue of the hour before dawn. The stars are still there, each one sharp and cold and perfectly placed, as if the universe had arranged them for this particular night as a gift to whoever was still awake enough to look. A breath of wind moves through the narrow window, making the candle flame lean sideways and then recover, lean and recover, a small drama of persistence in the quiet room. She set the spindle down some time ago. The thread is wound and counted and set away for tomorrow. The keys at her belt are still. The household sleeps around her. The children's slow breath from the corner, the deeper rhythm of the fire settling into its late-night patience, the creak of the old timbers adjusting to the cold, all of it folded into the particular piece of a house that has been taken care of and knows it. Across the village, across the estate, across the kingdom, in cottages and castles and convents, in the rooms above the merchant's shop and the cell of the anchoress, in the still room and the solar and the great hall, thousands of women have gone through the same day, a day that was largely invisible to the chroniclers and the historians and the writers of official records, a day that was nonetheless absolutely essential to the continuation of everything that those chronicles and histories describe, the feast that was arranged, the plague patient who was nursed, the accounts that were kept, the thread that was spun, the fever that was brought down, the child who was kept warm, the garden that was tended, the bread that was baked, the story that was told. These are the things that hold the world together, not the battles, not the treaties, not the successions and the schisms and the great political dramas that fill the history books. The world is held together day after day and year after year and century after century by the daily, determined, unremarkable, extraordinary work of people who simply did what needed doing, who did not wait to be acknowledged or celebrated or recorded, who went to bed knowing that tomorrow there would be more of the same, and who got up the next morning and did it again. The medieval women we have visited tonight, the unnamed spinner by her fire, the keeper of keys in the castle, the brewster and the market woman, the wise healer in her physic garden, the abbess in her cloister, the plague nurse in her devastated town, the queen regent in her husband's absence, the anchoress in her cell writing the words that would outlast her by centuries. They were not exceptional in wanting to survive. They were exceptional in the skill and determination and endurance with which they did it, in a world that was harder than ours in almost every measurable way, and that refused, with relentless consistency, to acknowledge what they were contributing. We acknowledge it now. This is part of what these stories are for, not only to ease the passage into sleep, though that is their gentle purpose on this quiet night, but to hold in the light for a moment the lives that history forgot to properly notice, to say, you were there, we know. What you did mattered. It still matters, in all the ways that the past matters to the present, in the continuities that run beneath the surface of every day, in the accumulated human wisdom that is the real inheritance of history, in the simple, profound fact that every person alive today is alive because someone, in every generation going back to the beginning of human time, did the work of keeping people alive. The candle gutters, the flame bends low, almost horizontal, trembles for a moment on the edge of extinction, and then steadies, a small miracle, barely noticed, in a room full of sleeping people. Outside, the first birds have begun, too early yet for the light, but aware somehow in the way that birds are aware that the darkness is approaching its end. A single note, questioning, from the hedgerow beyond the garden wall. Then silence again. Then another note slightly different from further away. The world is beginning to remember that morning is coming. Sleep, dear listener. You have walked a long way tonight, through castle halls and village lanes, through plague years and feast days, through the candlelit hours of women who are gone, but whose presence you have felt, real and close, in every room of this long and gentle story. Their patience is your inheritance, their endurance is your comfort, their work, all of it, the thread and the bread and the preserved fruit and the nursed patient and the kept account and the told story, is woven into the fabric of the world you inhabit, invisible and everywhere, the foundation beneath everything. The fire is breathing. The stars are still moving slowly on their ancient course. The house is warm. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Sleep. You are in good company. You have always been in good company. The world will be here in the morning, held together as it always has been by hands like hers. Good night. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.